I recently finished the Ringed City expansion for Dark Souls 3, and my immediate reaction after beating the final boss was, I am definitely done with Dark Souls. No one is more surprised than me that I felt this sense of finality and exhaustion. I've loved these games since I first played Demon's Souls in 2011. That game was pure fanbait for role-playing and adventure junkies like me who grew up in the SNES era. It was a hybrid of Japanese action RPG gameplay cloaked in a Western dark fantasy setting. The retro vibe and deliberately restrained presentation made players feel like they were discovering a long-lost gaming gem that just so happened to look and play like a modern console game. The gameplay is challenging, uncompromising, and purposefully opaque, but not unfair. The story is complicated and non-linear, with little in the way of direct exposition, and it richly rewards those who play archaeologist and piece together the game's fragmented lore. In the late 2000s, when auto-aim and regenerating health were the norm in big-budget AAA game production, Demon's Souls was a straightforward love letter to the idea that games can be difficult, mysterious, and obtuse, and that the player's success must be earned, not given. When Dark Souls released in 2012 as the spiritual successor to Demon's Souls, it refined and improved upon the original's formula so well that it became an instant classic. Demon's Souls was a cult hit that propelled niche Japanese developer From Software out of obscurity, so Dark Souls saw the same director and team returning to their winning formula to make a game for a wider audience. Dark Souls is a modern masterpiece, and is rightly held up as one of the best video games of all time. Like an art house exhibit where the audience becomes part of the experience, you cannot be passive when you engage with it. It demands that you commit yourself to playing, whether that's figuring out the gameplay systems, piecing together the lore, or even the simple lack of a pause feature. There is nothing quite like it. So with the surprise success of Demon's Souls and then Dark Souls, it was inevitable that the series would continue. No publisher is going to pass up a potentially profitable sequel, even if it's a very, very bad idea. And this presented a unique problem for Dark Souls, because the very idea of a sequel is undercut by the game's systems, story, and themes. And when we look critically at Dark Souls and the two sequels that followed, it's easy to see why, enjoyable as they were never going to live up to the original. And it's why I hope sincerely that FromSoft never makes another Dark Souls game. A major theme in Dark Souls is the idea of hollowing. Like many in the game's dying world, the player is affected by the undead curse and cannot die, leaving them doomed to rise when they fall. As this process repeats over and over for the undead, their memories and sense of self fade, and they go insane, eventually becoming mindless, zombie hollows. Your quest and your struggle is to try to break this curse, to allow yourself to die naturally, so that the cycle of life can continue. On a surface level, this is a neat bit of storytelling that explains the repeated deaths and resurrections of you, the player. It's a hard game, and you're gonna die a lot, so this grounds the gameplay experience with a convincing story hook. It's also profound theming that draws on spirituality and philosophy from around the world, both past and present. Cultures all around the world and throughout history have maintained a shared concept of eternal recurrence, that time and existence do not move along a linear path, but instead loop in endlessly repeating cycles. Cultures in ancient Egypt, Central America, and East Asia all maintained different religions and philosophies about how people and events do not proceed from point A to point B, but continue to occur over and over again in different forms and appearances. And life, like the cycles of history, recurs and replenishes itself endlessly. It's born, it grows, it dies, and it's born again. This belief system was also adopted by many schools of thought in the West, most famously by Pythagoras and the Stoics of ancient Greece. But it fell out of favor with the rise of Abrahamic religions in the West, and survived into the Middle Ages and the present through various forms of mysticism, most famously alchemy. One of the defining symbols of Renaissance alchemists is also one of the most famous symbols of this eternal cycle: the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. All of this has happened before, and all of this will happen again.
All this has happened before, and will happen again. 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 Again.
This concept of eternal recurrence is the beating heart of Dark Souls. The player struggles against the endless recurrence of events, of repetition piled upon repetition, to free themselves from the chains of fate. And what makes this game truly special is how these story themes are reflected in the gameplay and systems. It's a punishing experience of trial and error as you learn enemy patterns and placements, and figure out how to navigate the intricate, labyrinthine levels. You'll go through many repetitive cycles as you perfect your approach on a tough boss, or discover the way through to the next level. Throughout this, the game is a stern but fair disciplinarian, gently guiding you along the way and giving you plenty of chances to succeed. Until finally, you figure out how to overcome the challenge in front of you and break the cycle. And then, you arrive at the next area, and the process begins again. In the lore of Dark Souls, this concept is expressed with fire, through its growth, its ascent, and its eventual decay. The gods became gods through their mastery of the first flame, and came to control the world. But the flame faded, as all fire does, and with it, the gods' power. But the gods defied nature by linking the first flame, perpetually extending the Age of Fire, and with it, their own power.
Clinging to his Age of Fire, and in dire fear of humans, and the Dark Lord who would one day be born amongst them, Lord Gwyn resisted the course of nature by sacrificing himself to link the fire and commanding his children to shepherd the humans. Gwyn has blurred your past.
Because of the gods' hubris, the inhabitants of the world of Dark Souls began to fall to the undead curse, doomed to die and rise again, over and over, until they go hollow. And in order to prolong this cycle and temporarily lift the undead curse from the world, you, the so-called chosen undead, must sacrifice yourself to rekindle the first flame. The world of Dark Souls is not that of traditional high fantasy, all white gleaming walls of Gondor, but of its abandoned ruins hundreds of years in the future. The gods are fallen and debased, and their storybook city in the clouds is abandoned. When you finally meet them, they are decrepit and twisted things, practically begging to be put out of their mercy. Those who struggle to maintain their power at all cost and refuse to accept their place in the cycle are doomed to fail. This theme is so central to Dark Souls that series creator Hidetaka Miyazaki originally said he didn't want to make another Souls game, and it's why he stepped down as the series director when FromSoft announced the inevitable sequel. As he told Edge magazine in 2013,
"Everybody knows what the core of Dark Souls is. The dev team does, the fans do, the media does, and that will never change. I wouldn't really care for Dark Souls 8 to come out. That's not the point. It's more, what do the fans want? We want to stay true to what they expect."
The cracks in the facade were obvious the moment Dark Souls 2 arrived in 2014. The game was good, but ultimately just a bigger and more shallow version of the original. There was more of everything. More enemy types, more weapons, more bosses, more levels and environments, and many, many more self-conscious callbacks to the previous games. And best of all, more lore!
Do you know the Doozer lore? Love it as your own.
Goodbye, lore.
Dark Souls 2 even acknowledges its own diminishing returns and internal contradictions in its final hours.
You who link the fire. You who bear the curse. Once the fire is linked, souls will flourish anew, and all of this will play out again. It is your choice to embrace or renounce this.
Your struggle to break the undead curse turns out to ultimately be futile, and you've simply prolonged this pointless cycle once more. I was optimistic, but also a little nervous for the release of Dark Souls 3. Hidetaka Miyazaki was returning as the game's director, and he promised to address fans' criticisms of Dark Souls 2. So, after a year with the game, and having completed the supposed final piece of the Souls trilogy with the Ringed City expansion, I can only hope that Miyazaki-san will stay true to his word, and that this is the last we'll see of Souls for a while, or forever. Dark Souls 3 is a great game, and there's an obvious improvement in quality with Miyazaki back at the helm. It's course-corrected on a lot of the mistakes that 2 made, and it even goes toe-to-toe with the first game in terms of level design and boss fights. It's polished, focused, and generally a worthwhile experience. On its own merits, it was one of 2016's best games. But throughout it, I couldn't help but shake that lurking sense of finality and exhaustion. For the 3rd time in the series, the player has assumed the role of a nameless undead, tasked with rekindling the power of the gods to extend the life of a dying world once more. The world of the 3rd game is the Dark Souls universe taken to its extreme conclusion. The first flame has been kindled and rekindled so many times that the story of the chosen undead from the first game has become a kind of religious ritual, a twisted parody of itself. These constantly churning cycles of flame have begun to spread ash across the world, burying entire landscapes under a formless gray blanket, returning the state of the world to its primordial origins. The events of the first 2 games are now enshrined as legend and myth, with the player character assuming a sacred duty as the champion of Ash to continue the Age of Fire. Just like the gods, the player clings to their existence by repeating a ritual, both the in-game ritual of linking the fire and the meta ritual of holding a controller and playing another Dark Souls game. Looking back at the entire series now, I think the exhaustion I was feeling after finishing Dark Souls 3 is how the creators wanted longtime fans to feel. And that's also why I truly hope this is the last Dark Souls game. All things must end, even a legendary series like Dark Souls. At the end of everything, the Souls games have always understood that repeating yourself over and over leads to diminishing returns, until you eventually wither and fade away, a husk of your former self. And this concept is made manifest in Dark Souls 3 during the finale of the base game, which is also the setting of the final expansion. The Dreg Heap, the literal ash heap of history at the bottom of the world. After countless millennia of repeating the cycle of flame, all of the world's kingdoms have crumbled into dust, settling one atop the other in a forgotten place at the world's end. In this sense, it's clear that the game itself understands that it must break its own cycle, and must come to an end. These acts of endless repetition, of prolonging something beyond its natural lifespan, will always end in ruin. The places and particulars may change a little with each rekindling of the flame, but the results are always the same. The only way forward, the only hope for the future, is for one cycle to end, and the next one to begin. Dark Souls teaches us that existence can be a beautiful journey of emotional highs and lows, of struggles and triumphs. And this journey is only meaningful because it's finite, and will someday come to a close. But this doesn't mean that what we've learned from the Souls series must disappear along with the end of the Age of Fire. The cool thing is that FromSoft already has a winning blueprint for how to uphold the legacy of Dark Souls: Bloodborne, which sold millions and won widespread critical acclaim. Bloodborne retains many key systems and gameplay elements from Dark Souls, but strips everything down in favor of a faster-paced and more action-oriented approach, trading dragons and castles for 19th century Gothic horror and Victorian grandeur. And most importantly, Bloodborne shows that the Souls formula is at its strongest when it follows its own advice. Accept the natural cycle and the changes that come with it.